Hi, my name's Jane Kingsley-Smith. I'm a professor at the University of Roehampton in London, and I'm going to talk about Shakespeare's sonnets, and specifically half of the collection 1 to 80. Now in terms of narrative, there's quite a distinct group of sonnets at the beginning which deals with procreation, specifically a speaker urging a young beautiful man to preserve his beauty and his social class through procreation, through begetting a child. But there's an interesting kind of shift after Sonnet 17 where it emerges that the speaker has some kind of romantic feelings for the young man, and also that poetry might be the best way of preserving his memory and his fame. The rest of the collection, we find poems about absence and insomnia, the distance, physical distance between the lovers. We also find poems about how to write poetry. If you're constantly flattering the same person and repeating the same language that other poets are using in a conventional way, how are you going to be original? And also this emerging notion of a rival poet who may be a rival in affections as well as kind of in professional terms. And there are also a lot of sonnets on time, mortality. The speaker feels himself to be significantly older than the male addressee. So this question of whether he's worthy, whether he should be remembered after his death, these are some of the preoccupations, and obviously they carry on into the rest of the collection as well. So I thought we would focus on 3 sonnets as raising some kind of particularly interesting questions and exemplifying some of what Shakespeare's sonnets are about. And these are sonnets 15, 35 and 20. And I'm not going to talk about them in their chronological order because I think sometimes we can get a bit too obsessed with where these sonnets fit into a narrative, and we can actually get much more out of them if we look at them as kind of discrete lyrics. So if we start with sonnet 15, I've got my copy here. I'm just going to read it briefly and then make a few points, but there'll be things that you want to think about further and go back to. So sonnet 15. When I consider everything that grows, holds imperfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decreased, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay to change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. Now this is an interesting sonnet in the sense that it has a number of kind of structural features that we'll find elsewhere. So notice the beginnings of 3 quatrains, when, then. So there's a kind of argument that develops. When I consider, when I perceive, then the conceit. And that then comes at the beginning of the sestet. So it really kind of moves the argument on. And we'll find this in a number of other sonnets. Also notice the use of caesura. This is a break in the verse line. And Shakespeare uses this in a remarkable kind of masterful way, I think. So obviously this is a sonnet about human mortality, about the fact that as soon as one reaches a kind of perfection of beauty, decay kind of sets in. And there's a horticultural metaphor all the way through the poem, and this idea of man's life being as kind of brief and beautiful as that of a flower is something that Shakespeare explores further elsewhere, but also this idea that external beauty might be belied by kind of inner moral corruption. He uses flower imagery for this as well, so we'll see this later. Also notice the use of theatrical imagery, particularly line 3, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows. Shows being kind of transitory, delusional, brief, in a sense, are kind of artificial. But obviously this is a motif Shakespeare uses a lot, that famous line in As You Like It, all the world's a stage. And these kinds of images come together perhaps in that line, vaunt in their youthful sap at height decrease. So that's where that caesura is, vaunt in their youthful sap, so they boast in their youthful beauty, and then you have that crucial pause, at height decrease. So it, in a sense, is performing that notion of line 2, holds in perfection but a little moment. One thing that's interesting, I think, here is that time is the threat, is personified, wasteful time debateth with decay. But it seems like there's another protagonist here, which is decay. Now, time can do all the wasting and decaying on its own. So there's an interesting introduction of this idea of corruption or infection, which we find associated with the young man. To change your day of youth to sullied night. Why sullied? It links up with 67, 68, which talk as well about wherefore with infection doth he live, that kind of idea. So whether it's just time or whether it's his own kind of sexual proclivities, his own vices that might lead to his downfall is kind of subtly suggested here. And then there's some marvellous puns. As he takes from you, I engraft you new. Engraft is obviously a horticultural term by which you create a new plant. But it contains a pun on the Greek word for writing, grapheme. So bringing together those ideas of poetry and offspring as a means of immortality. But also Catherine Duncan-Jones in her notes says about the kind of brilliant wordplay here. So you have the word youth. Time kind of lops off the th to create you, and then the poet puts an n on the beginning, so new. So he engrafts you new, he changes the you that time is kind of attacking and makes something else out of it. Let's move on then to 35. Our 35 is not one of the most famous of the sonnets, but I think it's really fascinating because it develops this idea of infection, corruption, but also of what poetry is for. What is the speaker committing to when he repeatedly writes poems to this youth? And it also explores the confusion of kind of flattery and blame, which we find in the sonnets, where often the terms of flattery have this kind of darker edge. He's being criticised even as he's being lauded. So let's look at 35. No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in sweetest bud. All men make faults, and even I in this, authorizing thy trespass with compare. Myself corrupting, salving thy amiss, excusing these sins more than these sins are. For to thy sensual fault I bring in sense. Thy adverse party is thy advocate, and 'gainst myself a lawful plea commence. Such civil war is in my love and hate, that I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me. Now what's interesting about this sonnet is the conversational introduction, and that sense of drama, that something has happened off stage, we don't know what it is, we don't know what the addressee has done, we can have a fair guess. But that idea that there's some kind of relationship which has generated this sonnet. So no more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Obviously he's been expressing grief and now the speaker is responding. And one of the ways in which this sonnet can kind of connect interestingly with the plays is this conversational tone, but also you could imagine Antony saying this to Cleopatra. So we have a number of commonplaces here. Roses have thorns, silver fountains have mud, clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun. These are things that we can all agree on. Obviously what this does is to mitigate whatever the addressee has done, and to kind of exonerate him, take the moral responsibility off his shoulders. if a rose can't help having its thorns, it's just the way it was made. It doesn't have any choice in that. So he is excusing. But then at the same time, what's fascinating is that the speaker catches himself in the act of excusing and starts to question what the implications of that are. All men make faults, and even I in this, in this argument, in this poem, authorizing thy trespass with compare. A lot of the sonnets are interested in comparison. Is comparison a valuable thing to do? From Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, to 130, where he talks about the mistress belied with false compare. John Kerrigan talks very interestingly about this in his edition. So here the speaker is finding that he's, in a sense, morally corrupting himself by excusing the sins of the beloved, and that he is kind of taking, in addition to the things that the beloved has obviously done wrong, he is corrupting the lover by encouraging him to make excuses, to view the sins perhaps as less or more than they are. And then we have these legal metaphors in the final quatrain, and this idea that he's basically an advocate against his own best interests, because if it's a sexual crime, he's basically encouraging, or sexual transgression, he's encouraging the speaker to just kind of the addressee to just kind of carry on, which is not in his own best interest. That I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me. So he's taking what he feels belongs to him, but at the same time defending him. We might notice, I think it's called paranomasia, sensual fault I bring in sense. Shakespeare likes to use words with the same root, kind of against each other. So sensual fault, some kind of sexual transgression, sense, rational, reason, reason kind of versus passion, I guess. So it's an interesting poem in that it starts to generate more of a narrative, more of a dramatic situation, but also uses some of these kinds of structural devices as well that characterize the sonnets. So finally, we'll kind of lighten the mood perhaps and look at Sonnet 20. Sonnet 20 is notorious. Critics have always struggled with it because it doesn't fit what a lot of people wanted to believe about Shakespeare, and because it seems to address quite directly his sexuality, his sexual interest in the young man. So let's read it and see what we think. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false women's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. So this is unusual in the sense that it's a mythological poem. It's a kind of Ovidian story of nature generating this beautiful woman which he then falls in love with, and therefore has to metamorphose or transform into a man so that she can sexually enjoy it. So the assumption of the poem is that there can only be sexual enjoyment if you have male and female. You can't have sexual pleasure between men, obviously. So, it has a lot of bawdy puns in it. Prick thee out means kind of select from a list, but also give you a prick. There are lots of puns on genitalia. By adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. Thing can be penis. Nothing is usually viewed as a vagina in the period. So you might question, what kind of relationship is behind this sonnet? But also it raises larger questions about, does Shakespeare want this sonnet published? Does he want it in a public domain? or is it meant to be private? Notice the casual misogyny, the idea that, you know, you're much better than a woman, because women are false women's fashion. You know, women are intrinsically fickle, unstable, inconstant. This also ties in with an argument against cosmetics. So when it says painted, paint is a verb that was used at the time to apply makeup. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, so women aren't putting makeup on, nature has painted the beauty on. The master mistress of my passion as a key line. What does that mean? Does it mean sovereign mistress? Are we still in some kind of Petrarchan realm? Does it mean a kind of gender fluidity? And also another key line, a man in hue, all hues in his controlling. And the quarto hue is capitalised and italicised, so people have thought that it looks like a name. And Oscar Wilde is obviously the person who really ran with this and created a story about Willie Hughes, who's a player, a boy player that Shakespeare's in love with. I mean, potentially it means a man in hue whose facial appearance, whose beauty contains all other beauty, but also controls the facial expressions of other people. So he promotes desire through his beauty and changes other people around him, but is himself kind of unchanged. And this is something that we'll also look at in Sonnet 94. So we'll leave it there, but, you know, go back over these poems and you know, see what you think about them. They do represent an interesting range of tones and themes that we can trace in other sonnets in the collection. So I hope to see you for Sonnets 81 to 154. Thank you. Bye.